Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks to SHS and the chairs for the opportunity to speak today. Bring us home here. I have no financial relationships. When I initially got the invitation to give this talk, I thought we would sit up here for 12 minutes and look at really cool pictures of crazy things that happens to patients. And these are actually, many of these pictures borrowed from a friend, fistulas, erosion into the bowel, and that sort of thing. I stopped and stepped back for a minute and really thought about what would be more educational to the audience than maybe fun pictures. And so we're going to go a little bit different today and talk about when mesh goes awry in terms of when the mesh is actually potentially the primary contributing factor, whereas in many of the other situations I showed, there are probably many multifactorial components. So I'm going to start with a quick, mine not close enough. Okay. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the FDA recall. So if you actually go to the FDA website and you look at the most common adverse events for all hernia repairs, I think everyone in the room is probably familiar with all of these things. The only two things that are listed there that are unique and only can happen in hernia repairs with mesh are migration and contraction. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. In this publication that's a bit old now, but they reviewed the MAUDE database. And again, what is reported to the FDA in terms of complications based on mesh are listed here, the major ones, and then the minor ones also listed there. And again, these are things that everyone who does hernia repairs using mesh is going to be familiar with. When the FDA does a recall, there are three different classes of recall. The first class is one in which it could cause a serious adverse event, i.e. it has a probability of happening. Class 2 is when it might cause a serious adverse event, or as we'd say in North Carolina, might could. And class 3 is when it's not likely to cause an adverse event, but it violates some regulation. And most of these are voluntary by the company, and as we'll go through a little bit, the reasons for recall can really be quite varied. So one of the more well-known class 1 recalls was this composite hernia patch where the recoil ring was reported to break and can cause bowel perforations and fistulas. And so this is a publication that was put out, and I think it was a really great story from the authors. This actually got recalled because of 31 rings that were confirmed to have broken. It's an incredibly small percentage of those that were put in, and it's basically at this point where the ring was welded that the break was happening. But the authors said, you know, you've got patients who have this mesh in, and they are going to be at home, they're going to read about this, and how do you manage it? So they put forth a very thoughtful algorithm for how to manage a patient who may come in and say, I have this mesh, what do I do? Including ultrasounding and examining the ring to see if it's broken or still intact. A very different type of class 1 recall is counterfeit polypropylene. So this was some mesh that was out there that was labeled as something that it wasn't, and is labeled as made by a company that didn't make it. And so again, this is something that's very serious. It's a class 1 recall, but it is not necessarily a problem with the mesh that it claimed to be. It was that it was not what it claimed to be. When you get into class 2 recalls, things get a little bit more complex. So these are the might-coulds. You can have things like mesh sticking to the liner, the mesh failing, delamination, higher recurrence rates, and we'll talk about this one, and then failure to meet the tensile strength specifications that we talked about in the earlier talk. And so this is a publication that was put out, and there's a couple of these examples at this point where using a large database, they were looking at recurrences by the type of mesh and identified that one of the types of meshes that was in that large database was having a much higher recurrence rate. And that even when they did a multivariable analysis, again, it's retrospective data, but trying to control for all the things that they could, that odds ratio of having a recurrence was much higher. And ultimately, again, the company decided to recall that. And gets into a really interesting conversation about the power of databases for understanding hernia mesh once it's out in the market. Again, a different type of class 2 recall, so same category, but this is really just around technical details of delamination and incomplete seals on the packaging. And then if we step back to those things that the FDA said could happen that were really only available in mesh hernia repairs, contraction and migration. So contraction, we talked a little bit about before, is shrinkage of mesh. Could be due to ingrowth of fibroblasts, not being well fixated, or wrinkling. And certainly you can imagine that this could contribute to long-term hernia recurrence. We talked about the importance of randomized controlled trial. This is a very small subset of a larger randomized controlled trial, but looking at 37 patients, and they put in markers and measured the size of the mesh at a month and a year. And so that there were no significant differences, and that if you put the mesh in the right place, that you could probably not blame contraction alone for your hernia recurrence. And at the same time, those authors did a review of the literature and basically came up with the same conclusion. Migration is another thing that's talked about in terms of mesh, and you can see that this is becoming more popular in the literature. This is another review and defined mesh migration as invasion of other anatomical regions. And that organ, the migration had to involve another organ, including invasion, erosion, or adherence to. Unfortunately, what we have in the literature is that while we know a little bit about where that mesh was placed, most of them are unknown. And while we know a little bit about how that mesh was fixated, most of it's unknown. So it's hard to understand migration with what we have currently. In what's published, most of those were managed with surgical intervention. Again, that's probably how we found out about it. And the authors give a pretty good overview of some details around definitions, including migration, erosion, and dislodgement, to make sure that we are all talking about the same thing when we talk about this component of the mesh complications. And they concluded that there's no type of repair or material that's immune to the complication. And then, again, we referenced this earlier, but, sometimes we use mesh beyond what its actual capabilities are. So central fracturing or rupture of the mesh has been reported, and this is where we got to understanding that the benefits of a super lightweight mesh may not outweigh the limits of its physiomechanical properties. And here's just some additional pictures of how that central fracture can contribute to hernia recurrence. And I'm going to spend just a brief moment on biologic mesh here. So this is, something that we've talked about was really hopeful to address some of the issues that we have with synthetic mesh and complications and infection. There's a lot of work into looking at cross-linking of the mesh, which had some impact at a short term, but in the long term hasn't been shown to impact strength or stiffness. It's been increased use in our higher wound class cases, but as we talked about earlier, some higher recurrence rates and obviously some high costs. So increased use of non-absorbable synthetic meshes in these conditions has been reported in the COBRA studies already been discussed, as well as this one, which was also a retrospective study, but looking at patients who had ventral hernia repairs with biologic or synthetic mesh. Somewhat surprisingly, the biologic meshes had a much higher incidence of the complications that the authors were looking at, and that they actually concluded that the synthetic had lower wound morbidity and more durable outcomes. Back to the importance of randomized controlled trials. So this one's different because it put the biologic mesh in an intraperitoneal placement, and it was done prophylactically. But for those of you who do a lot of emergency general surgery, as I do, it's an interesting question: can we prevent those hernias? And their primary outcome was supposed to be incisional hernia recurrence at 18 months, secondary chronic mesh infection and fistula. And they actually had to stop the trial because the rates of complications in the patients who were getting the biologic mesh were so high. And it's interesting because they were comparing just primary closure to the biologic mesh, but then conclude that large pore polypropylene base meshes may be better suited, although that was not actually in their study. So in conclusion, mesh is a useful tool for surgeons. Why we're all here today is it's important to understand it and to know what it can and can't do. And I think when we say that mesh has gone awry, it's important to understand when that is actually the mesh itself versus the way that we've chosen to use it in a particular patient. Thank you.